What's up, YouTube? Today is part one in a two-part series on a satchel that I've designed. Obviously, it can be used for all sorts of things. I made it specifically with my new iPad Pro in mind. Remember that you can find all the patterns and artwork on my website, link in the description down below, or actually a link right here as well, so check that out. Once again, this video is brought to you by LONSDALE Leather. Check them out in the description of this video. I found this amazing piece of leather there for this bag, which would never have happened if I hadn't lost 5 hours of footage. I lost a bunch of footage and realized that I had to reshoot the beginning of this video, so I had to go get a different piece of leather, and this was by far a better choice anyways, so I'm very happy with it. If you're looking for something similar, it's a 5-ounce oil tan. It's got some pull-up qualities to it, so look for those. I'm going to trace everything out with my Satchel. It's really hard to draw with marker on an oil tan, so that's an obvious reason why I wouldn't do that. And at this point in time, I'm not thinking of beveling any of these edges. So if you're putting it on with marker, it's a harder task to make sure you get all that marker off in your cuts. So obviously I'm going to put some leather carving on this bag. You can use a wider range of thicknesses for this. I've got like a 4 or 5 ounce going on here. I might have preferred a 6 if I wanted to be perfectly honest, but because it's backing to the oil tan, it's not that big a deal. But just keep that in mind when selecting what you're going to use for the piece you're carving on. Also, you can see here that I used a Sharpie when tracing out this piece instead of the Satchel that I used on the oil tan. That's because I almost always bevel Vegetan, and it takes really well to Sharpie, so I mix it up a bit depending on the purpose. For a while I was using these Craft Tool Pro bevelers, and I've decided that they are garbage, so I've gone back to the old bevelers that I used to use. This is a number 2. It's pretty good for 5 ounces, about as thin as I would want to use it on, but you can use it probably up to 10 and it'll do a nice edge for you. Now I'm just running a stitch groove. This will protect your stitches because it nests it in the leather, so it's harder to rub against it, and guide you with a perfect line for where to stitch. And because I haven't used any sorcery in a while, oh yeah, that was a lot easier than doing it all by hand. Boom, there goes another one. And then one more. Well, I ran out of juice there, so that one doesn't get carved. I'm going to dye this with a Skiving's Light Brown Pro Dye, and I've been wetting my leather a little bit to help with streaking. Now, Skiving's Pro Dye streaks less than your regular dyes, but it still streaks a bit, especially if you're hand painting it. I decided to wet this a ton, and it really turned out pretty good, so just make sure you wet it enough and it's nice and even before you dye it. Painting with dyes is a bit of a painful process. You can see here, it kind of looks like garbage. You look at all those edges, there's some splotches. It just doesn't look as good as you think it would look. But the magic is in your resist and your antique finish. And that'll bring everything together and make it look great. So don't sweat it too much if it looks a little funny when you're first doing it. But you can fix that up once you do a proper resist and a proper antique. Now it's time to wax up the edges and make them smooth by burnishing them. There's lots of different burnishing tools. I like to show you guys some hand tools in this, but I do actually have a burnishing wheel that's on a motor that I use a lot. Make sure you learn how to burnish well, because it's one of those things that I took for granted early on and I didn't really try very hard to burnish things, or I just didn't burnish them at all. So don't be like me. Make sure you burnish your edges nice and smooth so they look awesome. because it really is those fine details that make your piece stand out from everybody else's. For my resist and finish, I'm going to use this Angelus matte finish and my spray gun. A spray gun is one of those tools that's next level for changing your leatherwork and making sure everything's even. A lot of you guys will notice that when you put a finish on your project, sometimes it's a little streaky. So this will fix that. Once I've put 2 coats of the resist on, I'm using this EcoFlow dark brown antique finish to get it into all the little cracks and cuts and really make my tooling pop. If you're using an antique gel finish or any antique finish without putting a resist on, you're doing it wrong. And that's something that I did for many years, and I really don't have a good excuse for it. Once we get the antique finish on both the carved pieces, I'm also going to put it on the uncarved piece to keep the colors all the same. And then I'm going to put one more final coat of Angelus on top of all of it to protect it. Well, I think this looks awesome. And it's a great example of how, if you're painting with dyes and it looks a little funny, you can definitely make it look a lot better as soon as you hit it with the right resist and the right antique finish. Here I'm using a LePage contact cement that I really don't like. It takes forever to dry and set, so I'm going to try and find something else, but the glue that I was using seems to have disappeared, and I'll let you guys know if I find something adequate again. I just don't want to use anything too toxic. I know there's barge and other contact cements, and we specifically have a room for dyeing and gluing things, but I'm pretty sure that that's not 100% fail-safe, and I'd like to use something that's not going to kill me. So obviously I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. This isn't a pattern that I had lying around, and I'm going to refine it for hand stitching. So when you buy it on my website, you will get a pattern specifically designed for people to hand stitch. But if you have a sewing machine, you can just follow along. I'm using this Juki 441 clone. I'm using some 207 white thread, and I'm just stitching in the groove that I made earlier. Hopefully. There's a few different companies that make this Juki 441 knockoff. There's Leather Machine Co., Cowboy, Texo. I think there's another one that I'm forgetting. So have a look around if you are looking to pick up a sewing machine. This one's for pretty heavy leather. I'll put a link in the description somewhere for you guys. Obviously this is a gigantic purchase, but some of you may be at that point where it's time to make that purchase. Tracing out my pieces and figuring out where they're going to be for my layout. This will all be on the pattern when it's finished, but right now, as I said before, just winging it. For anyone curious, I'm using a 207 size thread in this machine. It doesn't really matter, it's more of the aesthetic of it. Hell, you could just bypass this whole stitching process and rivet the carved pieces onto the bag. That'll look good too, I'm sure. So because I want to do a cool rolled edge on the flap of my bag and on the front of my bag, I'm using sewing machines. It'll also speed up the process for me, obviously. But you guys get to see 2 sewing machines and a bell skiver, which is pretty awesome. But on the pattern, you'll just butt your seams together like this older bag and just hand stitch it together. So don't sweat it too much, but you get to see some other tools that I have. So now I'm going to cut out some long strips in various widths in order to do the gusset of this bag and to do a rolled edge on this bag. I'm going to roll the front of the gusset as well, but in the pattern it will be a butted gusset. I'm going to run all these pieces through my bell skiver to thin the very edge of it, so when I stitch it down I can fold it easy to make that rolled edge. The gusset for the pattern will be just a butted gusset, and so you don't have to worry too much about the thickness of your leather. You can use the same thickness here, the 5 ounce. But if you were to try and roll the edge with this 5 ounce, it might be a little thick. So if you want to do a rolled edge on a gusset and you don't have a bell skiver like this here, you need to buy a little bit thinner material for your gusset. Look at that. Isn't that magical? That's something I picked up last year. I haven't had a bell skiver until just this year, so I don't expect you guys to have a bell skiver, and your pattern will plan accordingly. Here I'm just tracing on the front pouch placement. It'll be in the pattern. I was winging it. So here's that skived edge. So I'm sewing it onto this front pocket. And then I'm turning it and rolling it around the edge and top stitching it down with my sewing machine. The way I'm doing it here, if you're going to put some kind of a rolled edge on your piece and you're hand stitching, this isn't the way you want to do it, it'll be a giant pain in the butt. I'm going to link a video right here that I did where I rolled the edge and I was hand stitching, so you can get an idea of what needs to be done if that's the aesthetic you're going for. Otherwise, the pattern itself will have a butted gusset for the front pocket and for the main gusset of the bag. If you're using a sewing machine and your corners are not as gradual as you'd like, you can use those pliers there to try and get them exactly where you need to get them before you sew them down. I decided not to put a closure on this front pocket. I just sewed the flap on so that it's forcing itself to always try and close, and I figured that would be enough. If it's not, I'll add a closure, but for now, I'm leaving it closure-free for easy access. When I traced the positioning of this pocket, I obviously did it wrong. It is on an angle. This is just an example of make sure you measure twice, cut once, or measure twice, draw a pattern on once. Yeah, so it's, what is that, a 1/4 inch out? On the pattern, it'll be perfect, but since I'm just making the pattern up as I go along here, not so perfect. Here I'm once again sewing down that thinned out piece that I did with the bell skiver as I go around the entire front of the bag. Then I'm going to do exactly what I did on the other flap. I'm going to roll it and stitch it. A lot of you guys, when putting a gusset on, you're going to use little clips and clamps to put it in place. Make sure that you clamp both the top edges, and then you clamp the center, and then you work your way around the edge of your bag. I'm just trimming these corners because they want to curl up. This will keep them flat. And then we glue it with this crappy glue. Whether it's bags or pouches, it's really easy to put your gusset on cockeyed with a sewing machine. So really be on it, because otherwise you're going to have a front that's kind of twisted and it obviously looks like crap. So just, make sure you double check everything and sew it down properly, whether it's hand stitched or with a sewing machine. If I was to do this again, I might have done this edge a little wider, so it would give me a little more room to screw it up, or to not screw it up, I should say. I didn't screw it up, but it was really tight. Like, I could have easily sewn off the edge while sewing through the top, so just be aware of that if you have a sewing machine and you're doing this. And obviously, I'm using a Juki 1541 here. I'm not using the large Cobra Class 4 that I was using before. This is a great sewing machine. It's pretty powerful and goes through stuff really well. My hide wasn't long enough, so I'm making an extended piece here that'll go all the way around the flap and back. It didn't really work out as I hoped, but you'll see that. Now, if you're hand stitching this, I would glue all of these pieces together, and then I would use my chisel punch and punch all my holes with it glued together. And I'm just going to sew the front gusset to the back piece. Nice and easy, really simple. Make sure you have everything lined up off the start. Like I said, top, two sides, center, and then around the edge. Once we've got this done, I have plans to do a rolled edge around the flap and around the back. I clean it up a bit, make sure all the sides are nice. I could have done some sanding on it, but I was feeling pretty confident going into this next step. If you're sewing through a bunch of layers and there is any little bit of play where they're not exactly the same distance, you have a good chance of breaking needles or just not getting it in the spot you want to get it into. So here, nice and easy, I'm sewing that gusset with the thinned edge all the way around the piece, and then I'm going to glue it and roll it over and sew it again. The problem being, only the front flap is easy. There's not many layers, and it's flush almost to the tabletop. Whereas the back, you're going to have to twist it into place. And I was pretty confident that I would be able to do it just fine. And spoiler alert, that is not the case. With the thickness and rolling it around the edge, and how I wanted to sew it, specifically with that sewing machine, things were starting to look a little weird. In fact, they were starting to look a little weird to me right here when I started to roll the edge on the back of the bag. The front was fine, but when I rolled it on the back, I started to get a little worried about it. Here I am stitching around the front, no problems. It's only one layer of leather wrapped in my rolled edge. I've done this before, you guys saw me do it when I did the front of the bag. So I'm making my way around, and I get to the super thick area, like right here, where I'm starting to move into the back, and it's just starting to sew oddly. I break a couple needles. I'm confident that everything's looking good as I move my way around the edge. I'm actually, I wish I had a wide shot, bending the bag so I can get it flush on the tabletop. Here I'm desperately trying to sew the edge again, and I think I've got it pretty good. You can use an incredibly sharp knife to pull away the excess while you cut it. Just be very careful. Now that looks like garbage. Look at that. That is horrific, and I decide that I have to try and fix it, so I start tearing that rolled edge off with my stitch remover. I guess we'll have to see how things go in the dramatic finale next week. Thanks for watching, everybody. As soon as part 2 is available, there'll be a link right here. Make sure you hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for future videos, smash that notification button so you don't miss any of my content, and until next time, keep on being creative in whatever it is you do.